We are in Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6. And I'm going to back up and read 1 through 8 and kind of just summarize in general where we are in the Bible. And then we're going to stop and start teaching back up at verse 9. So it'll recap your mind. So if you were here last week, you're going to know right where we are. If you weren't here last week, what I'd like for you to do is sometime after this study, go back and watch the recorded version of last week's lesson, and that'll give you the chance to catch up there as well. So you can go do that on your own time and then go back and watch this one again if you want. After these services are broadcast, what we do is usually the next day, like for instance, tonight's study, tomorrow will be edited and it'll be posted on our website. So you don't have to have social media, and you can catch our worship service and our Bible studies that we edit them and then post them right on our website. So you're able to go back and watch those at your leisure. We cut out the countdowns. We cut out all that stuff that most of you, when you're watching it live, have to go through. Like tonight, as we're getting things set up, some of you are waving at me, making sure you knew I was on. So we cut all that stuff out when it's posted. So if you don't have social media, you'll be able to catch it then, okay? So a lot of great things happening, and let's get into Daniel chapter 6, verse 1. I'm going to read tonight from the New King James Version. If you have a different translation, that's fine. I might read a little different, but the message is certainly still the same. God's still in control. He still rules the land. So let's look into his word together. So chapter 6, verse 1 says, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss." We talked about that Darius is the new king, and we talked about how this is probably Cyrus, who was either using a different name, Darius, or was given a name. That this Darius here in this specific time frame is not in our history books, but it was not uncommon to have a different name that was being used. So this is often probably thought to be Cyrus, but there was a couple of other things, a couple of other possibilities that we talked about the last time. But he's setting up this new province. In chapter 5, we see Belteshazzar, that was the king at the time, or the second in charge of the kingdom. They get overthrown, and this Darius, the Mede, is now in control. And so he's setting up his government, and what he does is he sets up these 120 satraps. These were the administrators over those 120 provinces that we talked about. And over top of those, if you were looking at an org chart, are the 3 governors. And one of the governors will be Daniel. And their job is to make sure that the satraps would do what they're supposed to do and the king wouldn't suffer loss. We talked about that last week, that being taxes. It was a lot about the money. Let's make sure the king gets what he deserves and what he needs. And so the governors were highly trusted people put in this position, and Daniel was one of those 3 governors. Now, verse 3 said, "Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the other governors and satraps, because an excellent spirit was within him, and the king gave thought to setting him up over the whole realm. So the governors and the satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault, because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, 'We shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of God.'" So when it looked like that Daniel was going to be elevated to a position, and for those of you just joining in, we're catching you up to speed where we left off last week to get you started this week. We're in Daniel chapter 6, and I'm reading verses 1 to 5. So what we found out is Daniel was one of the 3 governors, and during this time he's gaining popularity, and this Darius figure is seeing it, and he's thinking about placing Daniel over the other governors and the satraps, and even elevating his stature even more because he was faithful. He had a good spirit within him. We know that his reputation, he's older at this time, probably somewhere around 80 years old. We're going to talk about that here in a little later like we did last week, but he's much older, and he's well known to having God with him. Remember, he was delivered, he was there, and God has been with him in everything, even through the dream interpretations, etc. God always seems to have his hand on Daniel. So the other 2 governors get with the satraps, and they decide they need to come up with something that they can hold over his head, get him to fall. How do we get rid of this guy? So they start plotting and scheming. They're like, "Look, we've checked the books, we've checked everything. He's not corrupt. we're not going to find anything against this guy unless we find out something with the way he worships his God. That's the only way we're going to pick on him or get him to stumble, is to bring religion into it. As far as he's not cooking the books, he's not skimming off the top. He's making sure the satraps under him are doing what they're supposed to do. King's getting his full cut. And so, they're thinking, how do we get rid of this guy? We don't want to be under, this guy from Jerusalem. I mean, it's ridiculous. He's been in captivity basically his whole life. And so he wasn't, Babylonian by birth. And so he wasn't one of them. He was always considered an outsider. Verse 6 said, so these governors and satraps thronged before the king. They pushed into the king's court, and they said to him, King Darius, live forever. All the governors of the kingdom and the administrators and the satraps and the counselors and advisors, all your who's who, have consulted together to establish a royal decree or a royal statute to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, king established the decree and signed it in writing so it could not be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree. We talked last week a little bit about it was rare for lions, in this case, at this time, to be used for a death sentence. Lions were often kept in cages and released to be hunted, but it was very rare for them to be thrown in there. However, there was some ancient East knowledge or literature that did show that at times people were thrown in to cages with wild beasts to be torn apart. So that very well may have been what this was about. But nonetheless, this was a capital offense. If anybody was to ask anything of any god, remember the king at this time was also looked upon as being a deity, being a god-like person. And so these guys got together, they played to Darius's ego, saying, look, if anybody, we've all got together and figured this out, if anybody asks of any god, praise any god other than you, or ask of anything of any other god but you need to throw them in the lion's den. So make that decree now, king. Live forever. We're going to celebrate. It's all about you, king. Well, of course the king's going to sign the decree. And he does. And that gets us to where we are today with verse 10 in chapter 6. And now we'll slow down as we start at 10. We're going to get through down to verse 28 today. So we got a long way to go and a short time to get there. Verse 10, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, that this firm decree, meaning it wouldn't be changed, now when Daniel knew the writing was signed, he went home. He went to his home, and in his upper room with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, and as was his custom since the early days. The Jewish people did this, but also the people in Babylon were said to pray 3 days to their God. So the fact that he was praying is not surprising. The fact that he was Jewish was not surprising. He prayed to his God. None of that was surprising. What's kind of interesting is he did it out the window facing Jerusalem. And so therefore we go back and try and figure out, is there anything about that? Is there anything odd or strange about him praying in that direction? We know in the Muslim culture, for the Muslims or Muslims, if you want to be specific, the Muslims, they pray toward Mecca. Saudi Arabia, they point toward the birthplace or whatever it is of Muhammad. So they often pray in the direction of Mecca. But what about Daniel? He's praying in the direction of Jerusalem. Was there any reason for that? Of course, that's where he came from. We know that, everybody was taken into captivity. Everything was stolen from there, from the temple. We talked about that in chapter 5, how how the king was celebrating and drinking and carousing with some of the nice golden goblets and stuff that was taken from the temple. But he's facing that way. And so what do we know about that? Well, to begin with, what we find out is scholar John Wolford, who wrote the Bible Knowledge Commentary, he points out that we have to remember first that Daniel's prayer was a prayer of thanksgiving. when he went there, he went to pray. We see that in Daniel chapter 10 or chapter 6, verse 10, that it was a prayer of thanksgiving as he acknowledges God's goodness to him. So let's read a little bit here in 10 about this prayer. We'll talk about why he's facing, or why the scholars believe he's facing, to Jerusalem, which is going to connect us down into some scripture in Kings. So verse 10 said, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, that there was this decree that he wasn't going to be allowed to pray to God, he goes to his home, goes to the upper room, and he opens his window toward Jerusalem. He knelt down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before God, as was his custom. So he was thanking God. He was praising God. Even though he knew this decree was signed, that he couldn't pray or ask anything of any other God, he's praying toward Jerusalem and he's thanking God. Now, maybe he's thanking God for his mercy and grace, for his deliverance, for his love, for being with him all 80 some years of his life at this point. Or maybe he was thanking him, saying, look, I'm going to need you more in the days to come, because I may end up in this lion's den, because I'm not going to quit praying to you. So we don't know that, but we do know the fact that the Bible's clear that it was a prayer of thanksgiving. He knelt down and he gave thanks to God. And what I want you to see is a couple of things about this prayer that kind of jumps out at us. So it's estimated that he was over 80 years old at this time, which would have been 539 BC. He would have been the age 16 when he was taken into captivity, or they believe right around 16, which would have been 66 years earlier, around the period of 605 BC. So we talked about that. So basically, if you remember, when he was first taken into captivity, it wasn't long till he was put into a position of interpreting dreams. That was his gift. And he was estimated to be right around the age of 16. As this is happening, he's in his 80s. And obviously, prayer life was a big part of his life. And it was a routine for many years. And for many of us, when do you pray? What brings prayer on in your life? For Daniel, even in the hardest of times, saying, oh no, now here's a decree that I could get thrown into this den of lions because I'm going to be praying to my God like I always do. Remember, where God is blessing, Satan's messing. I tell our church that all the time. That's been with me for a long time. Goes back to my good friend, Reverend Dr. Walter Truss, and his whole family. And I've always reminded us of that. Where God is blessing, Satan's messing. And so let's keep reading and see what was happening. So Daniel's there. He's praying. Verse 11 says this, then these men assembled, now all the who's who, right? All the who's who, specifically the governors, they're in charge. These men assembled and they found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. Well, that's telling God what you need. So they see him thanking and asking supplication of God. So they take that information and they run back to the king. We see that in verse 12. And they went before the king and they spoke concerning the king's decree and said, have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? So they pose this question to the king. Now, of course, you know what the answer is going to be. Of course, you know what this king's going to say. So they go to him, King, did you not sign a decree saying that if anyone does that, they're going to be thrown into the den of lions? Verse 12 says this, the king answered and said, this thing is true, according to the laws of Medes and Persians, which does not alter. Yes, you're right. It's a decree. It was that firm decree that we read about earlier that you don't change once it's in place. There's no loopholes. There's no gray areas. Once it's there, it's there. It was kind of a trap that they got him to sign it that way because they didn't want him to find a loophole. Remember, he favored Daniel. He knew Daniel was talented. Daniel was a good man. He was going to give him an elevated position in the kingdom, right? All that is true. But here we see the king says, this is true. It's a law that can't be altered, right? Verse 13 says this. So then they answer him. Now listen to this. Verse 13, chapter 6 of Daniel. So they answered and said before the king, that Daniel, I love how they say that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, he's not one of us, see? He says, you know that Daniel? He didn't say one of the other governors. He didn't say the guy that you respect the most. So they're almost racist here, actually. You know, because look at how they refer to Daniel. He didn't say one of our fellow governors. Listen to this. The words matter in the Bible. He said, so they answered and said before the king, that Daniel, comma, who is one of the captives from Judah, which is pointing out where he's from. Doesn't matter that he lives in Babylon now and has been there for 70 plus years. He's in his 80s, you know. Doesn't matter. He said, that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition, if I could paraphrase, praise to God, his God, 3 times a day. Verse 14. Now it's back to the king. See, in this conversation that's going back and forth, they speak, the king answers. They speak, the king answers, back and forth. And we're kind of watching this. If this was a drama on TV, we'd be watching this unfold, captivated to what's happening here. Verse 14, and the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself. Why would the king be upset with himself? Why would the king be upset with himself? Remember, earlier we read that all the governors, remember they were saying to the king before, all the governors got together, all the satraps got together, all your advisors got together, and king, we think this is a good idea. Well, they lied. Daniel wasn't there. They didn't say, well, 2 of your governors and the satraps got there. They didn't say it. Daniel wasn't there to speak up. There was no allegation against him. It was a trick. I mean, it was a trap that was said. And so when the king heard these words, he was greatly displeased within himself and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. He immediately was so upset that he did this, and he favored Daniel. Now he's looking deep within himself as, you know, what have I done? How do I fix this? What have I done? How do I fix this? Have you ever been in a situation like that where you've made a decision that may not have been the best decision, and it kind of comes back to bite you? Anybody ever been there? Richard says he knew that he'd been used. Absolutely, and that's what we're about to hear. And he's going to get very angry about it. But he's shocked, because right now what he knows is, I can't change this. How am I going to fix this? And remember, this dialogue is going back and forth. And at this point, they've got Daniel. They got him. I mean, they've set the trap, and Daniel's hook, line, and sinker right now. I mean, he's all in. So I'm reading verse 14 again. And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. He was trying to figure out, what can I do? How am I going to get him out of this? I would imagine he was talking to all his advisors, trying to figure this out. What can I do? Where's the loopholes? What can I do? How can I fix this? Verse 15, then these men approached the king. So the next day, see, they aren't letting up. They want rid of Daniel. Daniel was a threat to them. Daniel had favor of this king. Daniel was going to be over the whole empire. Daniel had God's favor. And sometimes you and I can have God's favor, and people who don't understand how God blesses, they can, do some pretty rough things to you or me or our families because they're jealous. Jealousy is a bad, bad thing. It's a cancer of sorts. We've got to be careful, because once it takes root, it's out of control. This started with 2 other governors who were jealous that got all the counselors, all the satraps, all the advisors on board. Now listen to this. So the next morning, and this is it, verse 15, then these men approached the king and said to the king, know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed. Think about that. Think about that. So see, they knew he was up all night trying to find an answer. They were talking, they were trying to figure this out. And they go back to him to say, king, what are you doing here? Don't stress yourself out. Just execute the man. Just put him in the den. There's nothing you can do. You can't change this. Verse 16. So the king gave the command, And they brought Daniel, and they cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, and he said, Daniel, your God who you serve continually. See, the king knew that Daniel had a relationship with his God. People around you and me know if you have a relationship with God. And if they don't, we're doing something wrong. Everybody that's in our life should know that when it comes down to serving the Lord, that that's important to us. Not because we have to brag about it or show off because of it, but we should be a walking, living, breathing testimony of how good God is. You agree with that? I mean, that's a good way to send some hearts up or type amen. Because when we have God's favor, that he's blessed us, that he loves us so much, that other people might just get a little jealous of that. And that's what was happening here with Daniel. And the king said to him, Daniel, your God, that's a capital G in my Bible. How about yours? Your God, whom you serve continually. I love that the king recognized that. He will deliver you. The king had confidence in Daniel's God that he could deliver him. Why? Because he always had been with Daniel. Daniel always brought honor to God. Everywhere, Daniel had God's favor. He had God's blessing. You know, God doesn't show favorites. I always say that if God had a refrigerator, your picture would be on it. My picture would be on it, right? I mean, he loves everybody. But the truth of the matter is, a lot of people don't understand what it's like to be blessed of God. If they did, they'd be following him. They'd be following Jesus, knowing that he loves us. But many people don't understand that. Many people don't get that. Somebody said, maybe you heard what happened with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Absolutely. Absolutely. And remember, everything that Daniel touched or did, God was with him. You go back into, to Joseph in the Old Testament, back in Genesis, same way. Where he talks about, what you meant for evil, God used for good. God can make something good come out of things. We have to understand. I mean, God didn't bring COVID-19 on us. He didn't don't let anybody tell you that. God doesn't make people sick like that. But what God can do is he can take sickness and bring something good out of it. And we have to remember that. Families sometimes get closer together. People draw closer to God. People come to the Lord sometimes in tough moments. Families that are really going through a hard time in their lives financially. Sometimes we have to get down sometimes to look up. If everything was so great in our lives all the time, if God was so, if everything was perfect in our lives all the time, we wouldn't need God. We'd depend on ourselves. Sometimes, we have to understand where we are in things to look up. But the king, and I want to get to this point in chapter 6, verse 16, the king recognized that Daniel, that the God you serve continually, he will deliver you. The king had some confidence there. And, he's hoping at least, because there was nothing he could do. He had made a decree. He had been duped into doing it and not thinking that Daniel was going to keep praying to his God. See, Daniel gave the king honor, and you and I are supposed to have honor for those who have rule over us. And sometimes we forget that. We have to have respect for the people who have rule over us. We honor God. We serve God. But we also have to obey the laws of the land. And I think that we have to be very careful about that. Because if we don't, then we're in rebellion. And if we're in rebellion, that's against God. That's certainly not reflective of what he would want us to be. Now, there's always the caveat of when the two things collide, God wins. But most of the time, thank God we live in America where we don't have to deal with that so much. Other countries do have to deal with that. And it's heart-wrenching. It's heart-wrenching sometimes when you have to meet in the basement, or you can't worship at all, or you're raised in a certain religion, and if you try and switch religions, they just kill you. We don't have to deal with that here. Thank God. If you don't have anything else to be thankful for, be thankful that you live in America where you can worship who you want to. Choose you this day who you want to serve. That's what Joshua said. Who you want to serve? The living God? The gods of your fathers? Or the gods of those other gods over there? Sometimes we have to make a choice who we're going to serve. Amen? Well, I'm feeling a little preachy tonight. I'm supposed to be teaching, but I'm feeling a little preachy. I got to be careful. So the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and they cast him into the den of lions. Somebody asked about the den. They said, well, what do we know about the den? What do we know about the den? Well, we don't really know, because we don't know if it was just, why would they have a hole with just animals in it? Why would it be more like a cage, like we talked about, in a place where they would keep these lions to set them loose to go hunt them later? Would that be considered a den, or was it actually in an area, a place where they slept? Was it in a cave? I mean, obviously people knew where this den was. They didn't have to give a description where to find it. People knew what this specific area was. So that's about all the information we have in it. And we know that he was thrown down in it, which leads us to believe that whatever it was, so if he would have been in a holding type cage or something like that, he would have had to have been tossed in from the top because he's down in it. But that doesn't necessarily mean it was a hole in the ground. You see what I mean? But it doesn't mean it couldn't be. But we don't know all of those factors specifically. So let's get back into the lesson here. So the king gave the command. They brought Daniel and they cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke to Daniel, your God whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. Verse 17, chapter 6 is this. Then a stone was brought, now look here, and laid on the mouth of the den. So see, that leads us to believe whatever he was put in, they had to put something there to ensure he couldn't get out, that Daniel couldn't climb out. It also reminded me, think about Jesus when he was put in the tomb. Now, he was dead on the cross, right? They could have just put him in there. Could have just threw him in there. But see, Daniel had some friends. Maybe they would have tried to rescue him out of there. So they just didn't put him in there. They put the big rock down on top of him. Jesus was put in there. They put the stone there. Why? Because his friends, they thought, were going to come and get him out of there. So they sealed it up and put guards there to make sure it wasn't going to happen. I think it's kind of interesting to think about those couple things. And God delivered in both cases. Amen. He really did. So let's keep watching. So a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, the entry point. And the king sealed it with his own signet ring, and with the signet of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. It was a punishment. It was a death warrant. It was a seal that I did what I'm supposed to do. See, none of the decree said that he would be executed by being thrown into the lion's den. The decree was he would be thrown in the lion's den, which everybody knew meant execution. So his ring to seal it, to say it's in place, it's a done deal, I've kept my word. The law has been executed. That's a bad word to use in this case, but the law had been fulfilled. The decree had been enforced. That's the word I'm looking for. And that brings us to where we are right now. Then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, verse 17, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring, with the signets of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel may not be changed, that the law is there. The fulfillment, the execution of the law was done. Verse 18 says this. Now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No musicians were brought before him. So think about that for a moment. The king goes back to his palace and he's not eating. He's beside himself. He's, wretched with the fact that, thinking about how did all this happen? 1 minute I'm going to put Daniel over the empire, and the next minute I'm throwing him into this den of lions. How did this happen? How did I get to this point? Who drafted the decree? Whose idea was it? So he's thinking about it. He's so bothered by it, he doesn't even want the musicians there. The musicians, think of David, who played the music. Sometimes the king just wanted to hear the music to be soothed, to go to sleep. You and I, we might use our phones, or your TV and put it on sleep mode so it just goes off. You got the noise, you go to sleep, and then the music stops. They would have these people play music to soothe you and to kind of rock you to sleep, if you will. I don't know if they did Rockabye Baby. I don't know what song they used. But they would often have them there to soothe. He didn't even want the musicians there. He really was wanting to be left alone. He, in a sense, was mourning. M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, mourning. He was in anguish. He felt bad. Felt horrible. Have you ever been to that place to where you just know that something's not right and it's bothered you to that point? That's where the king was. If you've ever been there, and it could be that way with a lot of different things, but if you've ever been there, it's a tough place to be. It's a lonely place to be. King had 1 million people he could have talked to about it, could have sought counsel for it. But in this case, he just needed to be left alone. He wouldn't or couldn't eat. He fasted. And then what else do we see? Then he didn't even want the music. He needed some time for himself, trying to understand, get a grip what's happening here in his life. So now the king went to his palace and he spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him. Also, his sleep went from him. What does that mean? Couldn't sleep. He could not sleep. He didn't want to be around people. He just wanted to be left alone. You know, sometimes when we clear our head, we start to think clearly again. We get beyond the emotion. We get beyond, the immediacy of what's on our mind. We have to be really careful. We could preach a sermon on stress and anxiety and talk about the conditions and how the body reacts to that. You ever see the pictures of the presidents? After they have been, they've been in leadership for 8 years, like President Obama is a good example. You saw his picture when he first took office and what he looked like. They put it up what he looked like when he left office. George Bush, before and after. The stress, the anxiety, the worry for the nation, the worry for the problems, the worry, that they carry the weight of that burden. It begins to wear on them. And I imagine this king really felt like he was carrying the weight of the world here, because he made a horrible decision that he wouldn't have made had he thought clearly before, right? And remember, this was a big decision, and you're about to see he's about to lose his mind. He's about to really get angry. So let's look. And again, if you're just joining us, we're in chapter 6 of Daniel, verse 18. We're in part 2 of our Daniel and the Lion's Den story, the story of scheming, how scheming ricochets, right? And we're about to see, be careful what you reap, because you reap what you sow. All right, let's look at it. So the king went to his palace. He spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him. Also, his sleep was for him. Then the king arose very early in the morning by himself. He gets dressed. Remember, he didn't sleep. Toss, turn, laid there, whatever. But he gets up. He's dressed. And he went with haste, the New King James said. He hurried, booked it, walked fast, used a Segway. He got to the den of lions. Verse 20. And when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice. And that's important. Lamenting is a word that means sorrowful. Lamenting is not repenting, because lamenting is like weeping sorrow. Repenting is sorry leading to change, right? So he's lamenting. By the way, you can lament and repent, and you can lament without repenting, or repent without lamenting, I guess. But in this case, he's lamenting. He's so sad. He's heartbroken. He cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel, and the king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to deliver you from the lions? I picture him doing that. I picture me doing it. And I would be so scared to utter those words, because you hope that you're going to hear an answer. But if you don't hear an answer, the lions got him. So you worry. And I would imagine as he hurried to get there, in that lamenting voice, he's not praying to our God, but he's probably thinking, whatever God he's praying to, oh, please let Daniel be okay. Please, for my own conscience, please. Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to deliver you from the lions? Now, the Bible doesn't tell us how long it was before the answer. In my mind, you know, when you read it in the Bible, you think it's fast. But I wonder, was it fast? Because if it took Daniel 5 seconds to answer, or 10 seconds to answer, that would have seemed like an eternity. Because when you're lamenting and things aren't going well and you feel really sad, 30 seconds is a long time. I have a lot of respect for people who pray for 20 minutes or an hour at one time. Because when you pray like that, it's just hard. Because sometimes you can lose focus and you can lose on where you're supposed to be praying and stuff like that. And you can get all beside yourself. For me, I don't pray that long. I can, but I have to really make an effort to stay focused. But in this case, he's lamenting in his voice to Daniel, has your God, whom you serve continually, again, pointing out that same God that you pray to all the time, has he been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, so they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done nothing wrong before you. What's Daniel saying here? He said, God saved me. God sent an angel. You wonder if it was the same angel that was in the fire with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? The one that was kind of in the image of the Son of God? I wonder if it was the same one. Something to think about. But my God has sent an angel and shut the lion's mouth so they've not hurt me. I don't know if he was down there petting them or not. I'd be at the far end of the den if it was me. But there was no fear there. And he said, and king, he said, I was found innocent before him. I've done nothing wrong. And he said, oh, king, I've done nothing wrong to you. Remember, Daniel respected the king. He gave him honor. He was about to be elevated in his position. Verse 23, now the king was exceedingly glad. Exceedingly glad means overjoyed. He was proud as a peach. he was beside himself. And he commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him because he believed in his God. And can I say, punishment was served. The decree was made. Daniel violated it. It couldn't be changed. This firm decree was made. Daniel's thrown in the lion's den. And now he's taken out. Not a mark or scratch, a lick, nothing. Nothing wrong with him. And look what happens in verse 24. Verse 24 is this, and the king gave the command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions. See, the king realized, maybe it was that all night, no sleep. Maybe it was that all night tossing and turning, so stressed out, that he realized it was their idea to do this. And they told me that everybody was on board with this, but Daniel didn't know anything about it. They knew Daniel would violate it. They came back and said, hey, you got to put him in there. So they throw all of them into the den of lions. And here's the wicked part. Ready? A lot of people stop there. They stop at the fact that Daniel got out of the den. But this is what you got to see. This punishment, this is the worst of the worst punishment that is like available to this king. Because not only does he throw these governors in there, and I don't know if he throws all the other 120 satraps in there, but he threw these men, which probably concocted the plan, but he also threw their children and their wives in there. And it said, and the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. What the king did was essentially annihilate their presence from the earth. They didn't even want a remnant of these guys who concocted this story. And how do you get rid of people like that? Then there's nobody left in the family. There's no wives, And there's no children. There's nobody left in that generation. Is that fair justice? I don't know. But it's swift. And it was probably very painful. And it was probably very hard to watch or hear. I can't imagine seeing the kids and the wives being, but what they did was wrong. And you and I have to be very careful. The Bible is clear about us touching God's anointed. What they tried to do to Daniel through their own jealousy, through their own pettiness, came back to get him. And if there's a lesson in this for all of us, is that we have God's protection, one, which is a great feeling and a great thing to have, that God's with us. He was with Daniel, even in a tough spot, even what could have been the end of his life, God was with him. But we also have to learn, we don't ever want to get caught up in the same kind of junk that could lead to our demise or bring harm to our families. Because God's not a respecter of persons. He's not. But his word is very, very clear. And so here's what happens. This is how we bring it home tonight. And we end this chapter. Then King Darius wrote. Remember, they wanted him to make a decree, and all he had to do was sign it. Right? They wrote for a king before. It was their decree. King, we've got an idea. Make this decree. And now, verse 25, it says, then King Darius wrote. This is from him. He says this. To all people, nations, and languages that dwell on the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom, remember, 120 districts, men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and he rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So what happens to Daniel? So what happens? Got to read, see? Too many opportunities to quit reading this chapter. Too many opportunities. You want to see if Daniel got out of the den. You saw he did. You might have missed the fact he threw everybody else into the den after that. And then you forget about Daniel until you read the last verse of this chapter. Ready? What do you think happened to Daniel? If you haven't looked already, what do you think happened to him? Well, here it is. Verse 28, last verse. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Now, the quick note I want to point out there, remember how we started the chapter and said King Darius at this time and place doesn't exist in the history books. The scholars said it was very likely that this Darius was actually Cyrus. And when you read that last verse, you want to say, well, no, wait, he says and. Right? And. But let's read it again. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. It's kind of like one of the same. That's what the scholars believe. Darius, because that's how he was referred to. But it was during the reign of Cyrus. What do you think? It's good stuff, huh? Good stuff tonight? You like it? I love this. Is going deeper. We go deeper than what you heard in Sunday school. And the whole idea is to look for things that you hadn't thought of before, or maybe hadn't read, or maybe thought about. Because it's when we do that, you and I can get excited about studying the Word of God. We look for ourselves. We see it in the context it was written, what it says, what it means in that day, how it applies to us, and how we can learn from it. And there's a lot of lessons in there. And I don't know about you, but every time I go to the zoo and I see the lions, I almost always think of this story. Now, maybe, the next time you go to the zoo and you see the lions, I know the women in our church, they all went up to the wilds. Abby took them all up there and had a great time. Next time you see the lion, you think of the lion's den. God sent an angel and provided protection to Daniel. Hey, thanks for tuning in tonight. Hope you enjoyed the Bible study. Check Facebook later tonight. We may have some information to share with you about something we're going to talk about tomorrow afternoon live on Facebook. So check Facebook later to see if there's an announcement or a time set up on that. We've got some things cooking for you we're excited about. Until then, God bless you. Have a great week. Make sure you share this Bible study. Hit share on Facebook so other people can watch it. Look forward to seeing you this weekend for worship time. Until then, may God bless you is our prayer. Have a wonderful Wednesday night. Sleep well.